Hello and welcome, everyone. Today I'm joined by Tom Lavers. Tom is a professor at the University of Manchester, and more relevant for us, he is someone who has written articles and a very important book on Ethiopia, a book that sought to explain the structural challenges that the EPRDF faced. And I thought I would bring him on to tell us about the book and to try to help us understand what the EPRDF system was in its philosophy, in its assumptions. And Tom has been generous enough today to make the time for us. And thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure. Maybe we could start with you telling us how you came to be interested in Ethiopia, Tom.
Sure. So my involvement with Ethiopia began about 20 years ago now. So I moved to Ethiopia, to Addis, for a job. I was working on a research project, a multi-country research project at the University of Bath, where I did my PhD. And they had a need for someone to spend about 9 months a year in Addis helping with the researchers who were working on that project, which was a study on well-being. Yeah, so I moved to Ethiopia and spent probably 9, 10 months in Ethiopia, most of it in Addis, but then also in different parts of the country. So I arrived in Addis in the aftermath of the 2005 elections, so a very particular point in time, and interesting. I guess at that stage, it was clear to me that interesting things were happening in Ethiopia, but I guess I probably lacked the understanding both of Ethiopia and more theoretically to kind of get my head really around what was happening. So when it came to doing my PhD a couple of years afterwards, I kind of wanted to study Ethiopia and wanted to get to grips with what was going on at that time, and ultimately settled on a project which looked at land. So all of the diverse ways in which the government was trying to use land and state ownership of land as a means of protecting the peasantry, as it framed it, promoting equality, but then also wrestling with these ideas of agricultural commercialization, agricultural investment, ethnic politics and ethnic inequality came together around the politics of land. And so, spent again another year living in Ethiopia, doing field work in Tigray, in Oromia, a little bit in Amhara, a little bit in the south, trying to get to grips with all the diverse ways which the government was using land policy and how it was trying to sort of combine these multiple objectives. And then since then, since my PhD, I've continued to retain that interest. So carried on with projects on social protection, state society relations, state capacity, and then most recently a study on dams in the electricity sector. And each of them trying to, I guess, in each case, trying to use different sectoral analyses as ways to understand the relationship between state and society, and how politics was shaping the use of different sectoral policies, but also how sectoral policies then reshape politics. And ultimately, this book is an attempt to tie together a lot of that research carried out over, I guess it would have been about 15 years worth of work across multiple sectors, where in my head there was sort of always some theme tying it all together, how this all fit, and trying to understand a bigger, the big project that the Ethiopian government at that time was involved in. But as often happens in academic writing, you're tied to sort of quite narrow focus on individual papers, but the book was an attempt to try and knit it all together into something a bit.
Well, we will see how many of these issues we will have time for today, Tom. But I thought we would start with the land question, because you say in the book that that was one of the two pivotal issues that the EPRDF sought to address in 1991. The other one being the national question. And the impression I got reading the book is that, of course, you don't think that the PRD provided sufficiently good enough solutions to either one of the problems. That in the end it was found wanting, and that it was partly why the PRDF collapsed in the end. But maybe if we could go back to 1991, because that is the one time, one focal point that many people go back to try to understand what happened. What were the assumptions of the EPRDF then in 1991 when they framed the constitution and the federal structure as tools to solve these two big problems?
Sure. I mean, I think it probably goes back before 1991 in terms of the, the revolutionary era and the period in which the TPLF was starting out and trying to win over the support of the peasantry in Tigray. I think at that stage they essentially had this dual strategy of, on the one hand, mobilization along the nationalist lines, but also this idea that you needed to provide material incentives for people, so to distribute resources. So part of it was around land policy. The TPLF carried out its own land reforms at that time, but also tried to provide some basic social services. And if you go on to 1991 and that sort of transitional era, planning for national government, I think the same basic ideas were there. So part of it was mobilization along ethno-nationalist lines, so the creation of the federal structure, which I think they were very clearly inspired by the Soviet Union and Stalin and Lenin's debates around the national question, which, yeah, I mean, in the Soviet Union, the idea was that this sort of ethnic federal structure would depoliticize and neutralize ethnicity as a source of mobilization, and essentially, remove that as a source of potential opposition. It didn't work in the Soviet Union, and I'm sure we'll come to it later that I don't think it didn't really work in Ethiopia either. But that was part of the strategy, and alongside that was this idea of distributing resources through the party-state structure in order to try and tie people to the regime. And to do that, you have to generate resources. So that's a strategy based around economic growth. And I think that was a sort of a consistent theme throughout the EPRDF's time in power. And it went through, I guess, probably 2 or 3 different stages. So there was an early stage very much focused on agriculture. So retaining state ownership of land, distribution of agricultural inputs to try and raise productivity, all through, related party-affiliated organisations like the microfinance institutions, cooperatives, and so on, with a view to raising agricultural production, but then with the idea that that would then ultimately need to translate into manufacturing. That with demographic growth, you would sooner or later you'd run out of land. You'd have that pressure on land in rural areas. And that you would need people, you'd need to absorb surplus labour, and so this imperative from the government's view was, of structural transformation of the economy, the development of a manufacturing sector which would create large numbers of jobs. And again, that went through various stages. So initially, it was very much focused on domestic firms and trying to build up domestic firms, sometimes with joint ventures with foreign investors. That then struggled in itself. And then ultimately the sort of latter phase was then industrial parks and trying to provide infrastructure to attract foreign investment to already established foreign firms to come and invest in Ethiopia. I think the common theme through all of that was very much this focus on distributive resources, generating resources that the government could distribute to the population, and very often through party-state structures that would tie people to the regime and sort of essentially provide political stability as part of their objective.
And you talk about this term distributive crisis. I think you see a theme that you constantly return to in the book, and I wonder if that crisis was something that was always bound to happen given the structure and the system and the philosophy that the PRDF sought to follow, it was attributable to a degree of incompetence on the part of the regime, and that if the APRDF had been more competent, that it could have been avoided. I ask that because when people try to explain what happened, one theme that you constantly hear is that they say if Mellass hadn't died, for instance, and if Hailemariam had been more competent and more assertive, what happened in 2014, 2016 in terms of the Oromo protesters could have been avoided. Um, I wonder what you think about
Mm.
those thoughts.
Sure. I mean, there's several questions there. I mean, I think the first one, in terms of defining this distributive crisis, I mean, I think it began in agriculture. So initially there was this focus on, land distribution as a means of tying people to the regime. With demographic growth as time went on under the EPRDF, they more or less put an end to the redistributions of land that had been periodic redistributions that had been taking place under the Derg. Basically, a growing concern that by redistributing land regularly, they were undermining production incentives and were leading to lower productivity in agriculture. And those views gradually won out. And so increasingly you had this, what I call in the book, of the individualization of land tenure, that rather than this collective resource, which is sort of periodically shuffled around and people would farm different plots of land, that individuals hold individual plots and potentially can pass that on. Now, the challenge is when you have that alongside demographic growth, essentially there was a whole generation of young adults who had very little prospects of access to land and an agricultural livelihood. And I guess that's something that struck me from very early on in my time in Ethiopia in rural areas, just how, the land availability, people farm pretty small land holdings already, but then when you have 4 or 5 children, the prospect you couldn't possibly divide it up between all of those different children, so at best one of those stands any chance of inheriting the land. And increasingly, it became less and less feasible for young people to aspire to an agricultural livelihood. Alongside that, of course, with education, many people wanted a livelihood employment outside of agriculture in any case. But that all built up into this imperative around manufacturing employments. And as I said, the Ethiopian government went through different stages with this. Mellass was very much focused on domestic firms, inspired by Taiwan, Korea, particularly Taiwan, I think. But this, essentially building up the capability of domestic firms such that they would gradually become competitive, and then could easily increasingly move out into export markets as well. But the reality was that, I think this is one, going back to your question about was this avoidable, the reality was that domestic firms were unable to really become competitive, and they've made very limited progress into entering into export markets. That's partly, no doubt, around decisions made around the incentives provided for firms, and you can point to various different things, but a lot of it ultimately was about the stage in which this process was happening. So Mellass was inspired by Taiwan in the 1950s and 60s, which is a very different era from the 2000s, 2010s, when Ethiopia was trying to tackle these challenges, in that the competition at the basic levels of manufacturing is so much more intense now than it used to be globally. As a result, the technological frontier for firms to enter into global markets is so much more advanced. And the gulf between the sort of domestic capabilities of firms, which didn't have much experience in things like textiles, and what you need to actually be globally competitive was enormous. And so I think it proved to be extremely difficult to bridge that divide. So that initial phase didn't work. Ultimately, the response to it after Mellass's passing was this move towards industrial parks, which in some ways is better attuned to the nature of the global economy, and it's the way that many countries have moved now, that you build facilities for firms, and you rather than trying to develop your own domestic firms, to sort of bridge this technological divide. You attract existing firms who are already experts in it, who are already embedded within value chains, and you attract them to your country. And I think, the industrial parks, there were problems with many of them, so there were some poor planning issues around them as well. But they were starting to show some promising signs in terms of attracting major global firms and relocating production. The challenge was that it just happened too late. So there had been a certain amount of progress in terms of creating industrial employment, modestly, by that stage, but by then, politics had kind of overtaken those developments at that stage, and you had the sort of political unraveling that you had at that point. So to get that, in a long-winded way of getting back to your original question of could this bit have been avoided? I mean, I think it's difficult to say with any certainty. There was some fundamental challenges presented by the global economy that I think some of the theories and the ideas that the EPRDF was using initially to sort of try and replicate the likes of Taiwan were somewhat out of date and not consistent with the nature of the global economy. Undoubtedly, the Ethiopian government made mistakes. You can point to sort of some big infrastructure projects which were poorly thought out, whether it's railways, industrial parks, dams. There was a tendency to sort of, I guess, as the pressure was looming, as the employment crisis, this distributive crisis was getting worse and worse, to try and outpace that crisis by going big with these infrastructure projects with the hope that it would be able to overtake. So, several people, policymakers within the government said to me that, we were in a race against time, essentially, that there was this huge sense of urgency and that underpinned this need to go big and to invest in these massive projects. Unfortunately, the result was that, in terms of state capacity, there simply wasn't the technological expertise within the states to manage all of these different projects at the same time. And very often what you had was sort of politics, bypassing the technical expertise that did exist. And you had these politically driven targets. So politicians get involved in designing dams and in deciding how much electricity they would generate, rather than people within the electricity sector. And similar things, I mean, colleagues have written about, not my research, but have written about the railways and some of the challenges that they faced, where you have similar processes. Equally with the sugar plantations and the sugar factories, same kind of ideas of politicians getting involved in design choices rather than involving sectoral experts. So you can certainly point to some of those things, but ultimately, there were some fundamental constraints that there were some major challenges presented by the global economy that it would have been very difficult for, even if they'd made good decisions, perfect decisions all the way through, it would still have been a major challenge to actually achieve this.
Hmm. You say there were fundamental constraints, and these are constraints that countries like Taiwan didn't face because now, as in the book, you make a distinction between late development and late development, and you put Ethiopia in the latter category, whereas Taiwan is in the former. And you say that, well, you mentioned it just now, that Ethiopia didn't quite have the technological expertise to carry out the policy ideas that the regime had. I don't know if you talk about this in the book. It's been a while since I read sections of the book, but there was this thing they called technology transfer, where they were trying to import technological know-how from the West to Ethiopia. And now, as everything else in Ethiopia is a bit cartoonish in its implementation and everything, but at least that it does seem to suggest that there was an awareness that this is something that needed solving.
Sure. No, I think there was from early on. I mean, you go back to sort of, Ethiopia's first industrial strategy was 2001, 2002. I'm pretty sure in there was there were points around technology transfer. Mellass talked about it a lot. He'd clearly sort of studied East Asia and thought about this. I think the reality of actually getting it to happen was a challenge, though. So there was a push early on around joint ventures between foreign firms and domestic firms, explicitly with this idea of transferring technology. I think the reality, though, was it proved to be quite difficult to implement in practice. That, yeah, in many cases you had manufacturing firms in Ethiopia with very little. I mean, so the key industries that the government targeted early on, things like textiles and apparel, the leather sector. There was a kind of a gulf between where domestic firms were at that stage and the sort of, the cutting edge of technology globally. And so I think it was a huge challenge to bring firms up to the level that was required, and then also to sort of enter into markets. Because I mean, one of the key things that had changed from the era of that when Taiwan first developed, industrialized, to the current world is the fragmentation of production. That in the past you would have had a sequence of industrial production within one country, and you move into one rung of industrial production, and relatively straightforwardly you could move into other parts of production, and you produce complete products all the way through the value chain. The reality is that global production isn't like that anymore. I mean, you look at what Ethiopia has managed to do in terms of the apparel manufacturing. Essentially, it's importing, for the most part, textiles made somewhere else and assembling them into garments, importing zippers and various other bits of the good, assembling together, packaging it, and then exporting. So it's captured one little part of that value chain. But yeah, it's not as easy as it used to be to sort of move into manufacturing of a whole series, all the different components of the value chain as it used to be. And yeah, I think breaking into those value chains initially for new firms entering into those sectors was challenging. And the success that they were able to achieve when it was essentially when you got established firms to relocate parts of their production to Ethiopia. And again, I mean, there was an emphasis even at that stage to a certain degree on technology transfer, that the idea that Ethiopian firms over time could become suppliers to these foreign firms, and that bit by bit, I think the hope was that you would, so rather than importing cotton textiles to make T-shirts, for example, Ethiopia obviously has some cotton farms. There's a textile industry. The hope was to connect all of those steps together. I think there were still challenges in the industrial park era making that happen, and then obviously events subsequently in the conflict have unravelled, and essentially the business case for the industrial parks is no longer what it was.
Well, to close the circle on the land question, and we will go to the other one, to the national question, because at least in terms of contemporary politics, I think that is the more relevant issue actually. But the land issue also strikes me as something that is very relevant. It's a live debate in Ethiopia, as you will know, whether to nationalize land or not nationalize it, or to privatize. And you say in the book that Mellass was completely against the idea of privatization, and you explain why he was against it and what dangers he saw. But if you listen to Ethiopians' debate today about it, it's framed in very crude terms, whether it should be the government that owns it, or it should be private property. There is no kind of space for nuance. But of course, in the book, you explain the thing that the EPRDF should have considered, the things they should have taken into account. But anyway, I want to ask you, what are the things that you believe they didn't quite appreciate in the whole land question?
I mean, I think the land debate is a complex one. I mean, as you say, it does tend to get framed very simplistically, state versus private. Um, I think to some degree in the book, there's another paper which hopefully will come out before too long, which tackles this directly. But I mean, essentially, I would say that, I mean, land tenure, there's an assumption that, yeah, the land tenure system basically hasn't changed since the Derg era. You know, the nationalisation of land, obviously state ownership remains. And essentially it's often sort of said and written that, yeah, land tenure hasn't really changed since that period. I mean, I think the reality is that it has changed an awful lot and is very much somewhere in between, what it once was under the Derg and a full system of private property, and is probably a bit more towards the private property end of the spectrum than people might appreciate. In that, yes, things have evolved over time, and I think that in terms of Mellass's views, the EPRDF's views on land, they did evolve markedly. And I think the resistance to privatizing land, I don't think that was an end point. I think it was at a certain periods in the development of Ethiopia that they kind of envisaged it was seen as an important thing. So one around distributing resources, protecting the peasantry, or at least, yeah, limiting migration was a key concern for a long period of time. So trying to limit how many migrants you had to urban areas at a stage when you didn't have large scale industrial employment. So the tenure system was it was seen as something that would evolve over time, and something that did, both in Mellass's period and then subsequently. So the changes that happened were, one, as I said, this individualization of land tenure. So with land registration, essentially, the land proclamations would basically outlaw future land redistributions and so on. So that was one step. There was gradually, through the sort of mid-2000s, a growing emphasis on land rental markets. So in the past, there was this sort of resistance to rental markets, that they would sort of lead to class differentiation. They would essentially there would be something like a full private land market, and that you would have people migrating out of rural areas into urban areas. So initially they were restricted. Gradually they were opened up. Initially in Amhara was sort of the most open, and the region that embraced land rental markets first, but subsequently to other regions. And then more recently, land for the first time you're now allowed to mortgage land, which again was something that was earlier on was something that was explicitly prohibited. The fear that essentially that peasants would get indebted, be unable to repay their loans, and then would essentially be expropriated in all but name. But yeah, again, Amhara pushed ahead and allowed that from, I think, 2017. Then last year there was a federal proclamation which has now spread that nationwide and formalized it nationwide. So it has sort of moved a lot. I mean, I think the reality is that in many cases, and one of the things that underpinned the protests was that land in areas of high demand around transport infrastructure, around major roads, in urban peripheries, was in many senses effectively privatized, and has been for quite some time. That it's still legally you're not allowed to buy and sell land, but the reality is that people are buying and selling land. There are these informal transactions, very widespread, partly driven by state expropriation, that when you have the state coming in trying to take land for and expropriating with very minimal compensation, as happened for urban expansion, for infrastructural development, for industrial parks, all of these different things. People, unsurprisingly, rather than being expropriated and getting very minimal compensation, then want to sell land, and there was a ready supply of people willing to buy it informally. So there were these transactions already going on. And so, yeah, Ethiopia is very much in this grey area. Yes, the state owns land and has quite sweeping powers of expropriation, but there's a lot of other things going on as well, and there are, in meaningful ways, private land markets either formally through rental or informally through informal sales already happening. And I think, yeah, I don't. Far be it from me to read into Mellass's thinking, but I would imagine he wouldn't be totally surprised by that. In that, I think there was an expectation that as time went on, it would be gradually liberalised. His hope would be that you by now would have a major industrial sector in urban areas, which would be creating large amounts of employment. So as you liberalise land tenure, you would then have the creation of mass employment for people to go to. I think that's where the challenge lies in terms of where the strategy unravelled, in that, yeah, the government was unable to find a sector outside agriculture that would absorb, the very large population growth that happened, and relieve that pressure on rural land. I think it's there, perhaps partly through government mistakes, but also partly through the broader constraints that the government was dealing with in terms of the global economy and the limitations on industrial policy. I think it's there that it really became difficult.
Well, I mean, it's fair to say that Mellass's expectations haven't materialized. I think that's fair to we can go on record as saying that. If we could return to the other issue, to the ethnic issue, or to the national question, and one thing that I was really struck by was how related and how intertwined the two are. But you say that in 1991, in instituting the federal structure, in writing the constitution in the way they did, they were trying, at least partly, to solve the national question. But you also say that maybe they overstated the problem. You even say that they actually there were sections in Ethiopia who didn't demand self-determination, for instance, but nonetheless, the system was imposed on them. And you get the sense that the TPLF and the EPRDF in general took it as a given that everybody wanted that, when in fact, maybe that wasn't the case. And maybe they also didn't seem to appreciate how the whole ethnic thing would metastasize and become a hindrance in other aspects of life. But maybe we could begin with your understanding of what their assumptions were in 1991 in doing the thing that they did.
Sure. I mean, it's one of the more challenging parts, because I would have said, I mean, you get a lot of insight into what the EPRDF were wrestling with and thinking about and influenced by in Mellass's writings about in the sense of development strategy. And so, he's written several pieces, a lot of it looking at East Asia and trying to reflect on what the relevant lessons would have been for Ethiopia. So that's quite clear. In terms of federalism, I would have said it's harder, and I think you're sort of more trying to pry, and there's a bit of guesswork that goes on there as well. I mean, I think it's fairly clear that they were, as I said before, very much influenced by debates around, Stalin and Lenin's work on the national question, and I think that is pretty clear. And I think Christopher Clapham described the federal system as this sort of wholesale embrace of Stalin's thesis on the national question, which perhaps is accurate. That it's, and you look through, the way the Constitution is written and compare it with the Constitution of the Soviet Union, there are very clear parallels in terms of the way it's framed. So yeah, I mean, there were certain parts of Ethiopia which had very clearly mobilized along ethno-nationalist lines through the 70s and 80s. Tigray, obviously, Oromia to a certain degree, and certain other places, but there were very clearly also parts of Ethiopia that really hadn't, or that ethnic identification consciousness hadn't really come about at that point. Yet this system was imposed wholesale. It was a very much a sort of top-down process of trying to sort of draw around linguistic groups and then give people ethnic identities and yeah. I mean, I think my sense is, and I think this broadly fits with what you see after from the 1990s onwards, is that much like the Soviet Union, there was this belief that if you gave people cultural rights, allowed for cultural expression of identity, with some very modest self-determination, so modest amounts of, ethnic autonomy and decision making, it would depoliticize it, it would neutralize it as a source of mobilization. And ultimately, I think the idea was the main focus was economic growth, structural transformation. That would provide people with the incentives to be tied into Ethiopia, and you would still have cultural identities, but it wouldn't become this sort of divisive conflict. That's my best guess of what the hope was at that stage. I mean, the irony of the federal system is that just at the time Ethiopia was institutionalizing this federal system, it became increasingly apparent that in the Soviet Union this actually turned out to be a really bad idea, and that the Soviet Union was disintegrating exactly along the lines of this ethnic federal system that they had instituted. And in Ethiopia it became. I mean, I don't like to be too deterministic that sort of the federal system in itself created all of these problems, because I think that's too simplistic. But I think it's undoubtedly true that it helped institutionalize ethnicity as the central feature of political competition, and that many distributive struggles, political struggles, essentially became viewed through that ethnic lens. And I think, I make the point in this book that, a lot of this distributive crisis, as I call it, it's the way it was manifested actually politically was in terms of ethnicity ultimately, but it didn't necessarily need to be. So you think about things like urban expansion, and obviously the big flashpoint was Addis and the expansion of multi-ethnic Addis into surrounding Oromia. You could look at that in lots of different ways. Ethnicity is one of them, but equally you could look at it in terms of population growth, in terms of capitalist accumulation, and so the expansion of the city and industry, and investment into real estate. And ultimately it's a class conflict of capitalist accumulation versus a rural peasantry which is then dispossessed. But it got framed because of the nature of the ethnic federal system. It got framed almost exclusively in terms of along ethnic lines. Equally with many of the agricultural investments, so you have government-sponsored foreign agricultural investors, some domestic agricultural investors, and those generally got framed as foreign exploitation of the role of indigenous communities, a Tigrayan-dominated government exploiting rural populations of different ethnic groups. On occasion, certainly some of the investors were Tigrayans themselves, which obviously added another layer to it, that this is then Tigrayan investors exploiting Oromo farmers, and again it got framed in ethnic terms, whereas again ultimately this could be framed as a class division. And in terms of what's the big issue in terms of this distributive crisis, I mean, to my mind, the biggest of them all was in terms of land. It's land shortages. It's the fact that that a whole generation of young adults had no meaningful way of accessing rural land. Yet again, it got framed in terms of agricultural investments. That was the flashpoint for the Oromo protests when they began. It was all around, that you had foreign investors, domestic investors coming in, expropriating land. Now, those were important, of course they were, and sometimes they were extremely exploitative. But in terms of the number of people who lacked access to a livelihood, those were minuscule compared to the scale of the problem in terms of just rural families without access to agricultural land and without access to meaningful employment opportunities. Um, so you could frame, yeah, it could be framed as a generational division between your sort of middle-aged landholders who did get land through past redistributions and the younger generation. Yet it tended to be framed as an issue around ethnic politics. So I think in that sense, it's the federal system. It played a role in reframing a broader distributive crises in purely ethnic terms, and not necessarily neutrally. I mean, in some cases, political actors, and I think this is one of the things that the federal system does. It provides, as a political leader, you have very strong incentives to mobilize your ethnic community in this kind of distributive struggle against other ethnic communities, particularly if you're from one of the larger ethnic groups. And so, yeah, it makes sense for leaders of certain of ethnic groups to sort of try and make those claims, and yeah, blame the other and use it as a tool to mobilizing your own ethnic group. And I think that's where it becomes particularly problematic. I mean, there were good reasons for some kind of federal system that recognized ethnic identity back in the 1990s. Clearly, the mobilization that had happened, it would have been quite difficult for the EPRDF to ignore that and say, we're going to go back to administrative regions with no identity whatsoever. But at the same time, bit by bit, it has provided the incentives for politics to be this sort of competitive zero-sum game between ethnic groups, which becomes extremely problematic when any disadvantage that your ethnic group is experiencing is framed as exploitation from another ethnic group. And I think that becomes hugely volatile.
And you draw some sort of parallels between how Rwanda tried to address this problem following the Rwanda genocide, where you say that ethnic expression was at least discouraged, and a sense of national identity was preached. And of course, in typical scholarly care, you say that time will tell if this will work or not. Um, and there's a passage in your book that I found really interesting, where you describe how Mellass, during the turn of the millennium, pretended to be well, a new convert of the Ethiopian nationalist persuasion. Um, and I wonder if that was him appreciating that maybe the ethnic thing wasn't working, and him trying to go the Rwanda way, he was just trying to respond to events that preceded that, because there were 1997 problems and stuff like that. So, what was your sense of why he was doing that? Do you believe that he sensed that maybe there was a problem in the way the federal system was designed?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's clear there was a shift from those early years to around the millennium and the developmental state era. I think there was an embrace of more overt national symbols. The GERD as a sort of as kind of the sort of the prime example of this sort of national project, which the government sought to exploit. I mean, I think it's probably a little bit of two things. I suspect, and I think if memory serves me correctly, so Alex Deval published some excerpts of some of his conversations that he'd had with Mellass, which I think hinted that he had in his later years did raise concerns that maybe federalism wasn't going in a great way and there was some need for rebalancing. I don't know how far he would have taken that himself, but I think there probably was some sense in that. And I think, but also, I mean, I think he recognized the power of nationalism, that he I mean, it's very clear. I mean, he clearly read a lot about East Asia. He was very equally like Korea, Taiwan, others. Nationalism was a key part of the mobilization of populations to contribute to development, and I think he probably would have recognized that. And you see it in things like the Renaissance Dam, like the mobilization that took place in terms of trying to get people to contribute, to buy into this project as sort of something collective. So I think there's probably something a bit instrumental there as well. So yeah, probably a little bit of both. This concern that ethnic federalism run too far was going to lead to some problems. But then also, yeah, this sort of instrumental view that nationalism itself was a useful tool to sort of to use in terms of this developmental project. And yeah, very clearly the developmental states, it's hard to differentiate it from some of the other parts of. It's got roots, I think, back all the way into the 1990s, but it really kind of kicked off around sort of the early mid 2000s. That the embrace of that label. And I think it was increasingly framed in national terms, that this was a national project. And I think for that reason that it was a means of mobilizing people and resources. Nationalism served that end.
Well, isn't it interesting because you say that one of the prerequisites for this developmental state thing, maybe we'll come towards the end what we mean by that. But you say that one precondition for that is that the state has to be at a certain stage of state formation. And this is where there is a significant difference between Ethiopia and Taiwan or Japan, for instance, where there's a degree of homogeneity in those countries, something that simply doesn't exist in Ethiopia because Ethiopia is it's a diverse nation. And one wonders whether it was correct for the EPRDF to assume that they had the conditions needed to embark on developmental state, given that Ethiopia is a diverse nation.
I mean, I would. So your leading examples. I mean, in the book, I kind of use developmental state as a. I try not to define whether Ethiopia is or is. I kind of accept it as a label that the government uses, and yeah, I'm not really into classifying it one way or another. And I think equally you can contest what a developmental state is elsewhere. But the main examples that people would point to of the likes of Korea and Taiwan were relatively homogeneous. But equally, you have examples like Malaysia being a prime one, which it may not be quite as successful as Korea and Taiwan, but it has, it's a wealthy country, it's a middle income country, it's achieved remarkable things, and yet is ethnically heterogeneous, and also at points has had, very severe threats of ethnic conflict between different groups there. So is ethnicity does it necessarily rule ethnic diversity? Does it rule out any possibility of the state playing a central role in promoting economic development, in promoting structural transformation of the economy? I think that, well, it's not a conclusion I would want to come to myself. I think I'd be very hesitant about that. It presents certain challenges. I think certainly, like how you deal with that with that ethnic diversity, and I think, well, clearly the federal system and the last 3 decades has not managed to depoliticize ethnicity sufficiently, and is, in many senses, that politicization which underpins recent conflicts has got more extreme in Ethiopia, whereas to a degree Malaysia has been just about managed to manage that at points. It was in the past, in the 1960s, it was on the verge of large scale ethnic conflict, but today is a prosperous country where no doubt there is still some challenges around ethnic diversity, but is nowhere near that stage at the moment as stable and prosperous. So I don't think diversity is necessarily a challenge. The question is, how do you accommodate that diversity in ways which don't don't politicize it and make ethnicity the key dividing line in political competition. I think that's where the problem lies in Ethiopia, that federalism is ultimately has done that. It's consolidated identities and reinforced identities and reinforced the sense that we are against you, and that political competition nationally is about blocks of ethnic groups. And I think that is I think that ultimately is an important factor, by no means the only one, but it certainly is an important factor, and obviously in recent conflicts.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you say that you don't kind of you're not comfortable calling the EPRDF case developmental state yourself, and I understand that. I think you use quotes when you say
Yes.
developmental state. So I should have clarified that before, but you made that point. But you do make a distinction between that and what you call competitive authoritarian state, I think, where you mentioned the case of Uganda, for instance, and I mean, I'm being cynical here, but I wonder if you were trying to imply that maybe merging the two together is one sort of one solution that could have worked in Ethiopia if the EPRDF had made room for nominal opposition in the way that Uganda does. Whether it could have avoided some of the problems, or maybe am I reading too much into the text?
I think you might be reading a little bit more than I'd intended there. I mean, I think there are certain. You talked before around what could Haile Mariam in that period in the 2010s have done things differently? Could they have averted the sort of the crisis that ultimately transpired? I mean, I think one of the elements was that clearly at that stage that the non-TPLF parties within the EPRDF were no longer willing to accept a subordinate position, and were increasingly assertive in that period. And he was wrestling with, how do you manage this sort of, obviously the strongest party of the TPLF alongside these increasingly demanding other parties. So I think it's clear that some degree of political reorganization was essential at that point in time, and a different dynamic to what had happened before. And I think the point I was trying to make in the book was that, I guess, going further back in time to the 1990s, when Ethiopia was, thinking through, when the TPLF, the EPRDF were trying to think through how do they govern this country they've suddenly found themselves in charge of. And I think at that stage, they came to the conclusion, they'd mobilized in Tigray, they had a solid support base in Tigray. Outside of Tigray, it was a very rapid expansion of control over the country. They, in some cases, were viewed skeptically, in some cases were demonized and seen as a hostile invading force. So I think they recognized that, democratization at that stage would have been they wouldn't have been able to maintain power in a democratic, open way, because they just didn't have the popular support base to do so. And they settled on this idea that they were, their strategy for maintaining power was ultimately through growth and, as I say, distribution of resources, distribution of opportunities. Now, I mean, that's problematic. At core, I see advantages in democracy, but I see that, given a choice between a government between an autocratic government that wants to achieve rapid development and improve prospects for people, even if it is for the sake of their own political survival in some senses, versus a government which basically just wants to maintain power and is willing to do so purely through manipulation of elections, I would think a developmental form of autocracy is preferable. So I guess it was in that sense that Ethiopia was unusual. I think one of the reasons why it was so interesting is that it was an exception to the standard way in which most African governments have sought to maintain power. And I guess Uganda is more typical in that the Ugandan government makes lots of pronouncements about how it wants to achieve structural transformation and development, but I don't think anyone really believes that it's that committed to it. Ultimately, a combination of repression and patronage and manipulation of elections is how they stay. The NRM stays in power in Uganda. Whereas I think for a period, the EPRDF leadership really did see, in the same way that Korea and the same way that Taiwan did, they saw their political fortunes as tied to this developmental project. And I think that's what's interesting, is that they were thoroughly committed to it, and they thought that their only way of maintaining power and consolidating their position politically was to grow the economy to achieve structural transformation. Ultimately, it didn't work out for reasons we've discussed already. But I think it was interesting in that they were really serious about it. They wanted to industrialize. They didn't, it wasn't this sort of half-hearted pronouncements and then do nothing. There were serious efforts and relatively deep, well thought out proposals to try and make this happen. And they made mistakes along the way, but then so did Korea and Taiwan. I think, as I said, I think that earlier era was probably more forgiving in Korea and Taiwan. That mistakes at that stage probably weren't quite so problematic, and there was more space for trial and error. Whereas ultimately Ethiopia, I think the sort of the efforts at trial and error and the evolution of the agricultural strategy, of the industrial strategy, ultimately just got outpaced by political forces, and that was what led to this unraveling.
Well, I was cynically trying to get you to say authoritarianism is the way, but you successfully dodged that. And but anyway, I think the whole EPRDF project collapsed in 2018. I think is fair to say, and different people have different explanations as to why. Some people say it's completely down to ethnic politics. Something that you don't quite buy is clear from the book. Others say that it was down to social media and that the PRDF wasn't quite ready to handle protesters organized via social media. But I think you give the main reason, which is that for the whole thing to have worked, the party and the people, whether in the TPLF or in the other parties, must have seen their own future tied to them defending the party line, to them defending, or what more than defending, they should have seen that bringing about economic change is also in the interest of their own political survival. And I think that stopped being the case in 2018. Some politicians saw that their interest lay in, for instance, supporting the protesters, for instance. And I think that is ultimately the main reason. But I want to, and we're about to run out of time, but I want to ask you, what are the lessons from the EPRDF experiment?
Oh, now that's a challenging question. I mean, I guess one of the things I wrestled with in the book is, and it was written in the period where the civil war was happening in Tigray, and it was a constant challenge not to be too pessimistic, I guess, at a time when it was a very pessimistic time, and obviously horrific things happening in that period, and from my own point of view, having followed this, I mean, by chance, I came to Ethiopia in 2005. At a time, I mean, that tension was always there. Obviously, the election aftermath was a problematic time in itself, but it was always this sort of tension between a problematic political side and some optimism that things were demonstrably getting better, unevenly. So I think that central challenge was that not enough of the people of the Ethiopian population were benefiting from it, but you could see that the government at points was trying to do interesting things, was thinking seriously about how to tackle the problems, and how to solve the problems that it was facing. And yeah, you look at pretty much any. I mean, it's in retrospect now. People have argued that they looked at all the problems in that era, and obviously the problems that have come afterwards, and those are undeniable. But you look at the social indicators, social economic indicators from that period, and it's almost uniform of things getting rapidly better, whether it's education, health, infrastructural access, economic growth. Yeah, it was a period where really positive things were happening. So it is tragic the way that it is unraveled, because it has, I mean, a lot of that progress has been rolled back, and obviously the horrific violence that has been going on, and in some cases still goes on at the moment. I mean, yeah, I don't know what would be the lessons you can draw from it. I find that a challenging question, because I think it is. I don't want it to be, oh, this was all, the prospects of, state-led development are, it's an impossibility. I think it is, the window for it has got much smaller. I think it's much more limited. I think probably one of the conclusions is that, yeah, I think Ethiopia is too diverse and too varied for a sort of a top-down, state-controlled process of development. I mean, yeah, I think there is probably some need for reflection on how, I guess, how much in that period of time. We talked about state capacity earlier. I mean, Ethiopia is a tricky one, because in some senses it was a very powerful state. In other senses, it was quite limited. But in terms of technical expertise, you could, at ministerial level, sort of top tiers of the civil service within ministries, you had really smart people who'd studied, who knew a lot about the world, who understood challenges. But beneath that, the technical expertise wasn't there. Like, beyond the sort of the top couple of layers, you suddenly found yourself that people often were working hard, but they didn't necessarily have that high levels of education, high levels of understanding of the sectors they were working in. And I think, the result was this sort of this attempt to compensate for a lack of state capacity with politically driven targets. I think was one of the things that needs to be avoided. And I think it is a sort of going to be, so the role that the state plays has to be better thought out and more strategic in terms of building capacity, and not racing into this sort of vast number of mega projects that happened, most of which ultimately didn't come off, wasted quite a lot of resources. So I think there's some insights there which I probably are quite useful in terms of thinking through the implications of this. But yeah, obviously going forward, Ethiopia is a very different place from what it was in the early 1990s and the 2000s. It's more diverse. We now deal with a political system which, for better or worse, federalism is a political fact. Political identities are very solidly entrenched. And the process of depoliticizing that and de-emphasizing ethnicity as your basis of organization is is a challenging thing. And I mean, again, you mentioned Rwanda. I mean, Rwanda has a very different history where initially ethnic politics was ethnicity was heavily politicized with catastrophic consequences in terms of the genocide. They then went sharply back the other way under another authoritarian regime, which has been able to impose the depoliticization of ethnicity and sort of try and impose a national identity. It's again, I think they've done that under one ruler so far. Will that outlast Kagame when his time is eventually up? I don't know, but I think they don't seem, it would be very challenging to try and, even if desirable, to try and carry out a project like that in Ethiopia now. So I think it's a gradual process where there are increasing incentives for collaboration and coordination across ethnic lines is desperately needed, rather than it being politics being this sort of conflictual, competitive approach. I wish I had answers in terms of how to achieve that, but yes, it's going to be work in progress and a big challenge.
Well, I think that's a very important lesson, Tom. I know that you're couching your language very carefully, and I
As
understand what.
academics do.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and especially given that the norm is to speak, braggadociously and all that. So it's a welcome break from that as well. Um, but I mean, isn't it curious that you say top-down approach doesn't work? Because when I was growing up in Tigray, we were constantly told that one of the reasons the TPLF for the Derg regime was to upend the system where things were imposed on us from high up, and that instead a new system where local administration will be empowered, will be installed instead. But that didn't, of course, come to pass, as we all know. And that makes you wonder whether the TPLF really believed in the thing that it said in public. Um, um, I don't know if you'd like to reflect on that, given that you have read all them, all them documents, and you have gone through the archives and stuff like that, because that is something that a lot of Tigrans want an answer for today. Did the TPLF believe in what it was saying in public? For instance, earlier you mentioned about how Mellass might have believed that with more economic integration, the issue of national identity, the issue of ethnicity um, would kind of disappear gradually. That seems to be one assumption that he had, which makes you wonder maybe he didn't believe at all in the whole notion of federalism and national self-administration and determination and all that.
Mm. I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, I obviously didn't experience Tigray in the period where the TPLF were mobilizing in the 70s and 80s. What you read about the studies that were conducted at that time did emphasize it as a there was some degree of meaningful mobilization of like participation and involvement in the movement. It wasn't just superficial. There was probably an element of compulsion in there as well, but there were opportunities for discussion and engagement. And I think even in the period that I was doing fieldwork in rural areas, so 2009, 10, again later on, years after that, it always struck me that there was a difference between Tigray and other places. That these claims were, I don't want to overstate it, but they weren't completely hollow in Tigray. There was some degree of, within bounds, within probably quite limited bounds, but there was some degree of participation and popular mobilization alongside elements of compulsion. And I'm sure that, ebbed and flowed over time. I think the reality is that in other parts of the country, it was much more the other way. Ultimately, it was largely rhetoric. They were, the EPRDF parties were never really able to sell themselves as popular movements because they never really were. They were always, to some degree, imposed from above, and co-opted local leaders in an attempt to sort of consolidate power. So did they mean it? I don't know. I don't think, as I said before, I think in terms of federalism, I don't think there was ever any real expectation within the EPRDF that federalism would mean meaningful. Probably a hope that gradually, I'm sure there was a hope initially that these EPRDF parties would become more a sort of popular representation of the people that they're claiming to represent than actually was possible. But yeah, was there any belief, for example, that ethnic autonomy could have meant that an opposition party in one of the regions could have taken power in Oromia or in Amhara or something? An ethno-nationalist party of outside the EPRDF. I don't think there was ever any real belief that that would be feasible. So in that sense, I think it probably was always a little bit hollow, that it was a means, I think, of that an aspiration to try and neutralize ethnicity as a tool for political mobilization and kind of capture that space within the ruling coalition. So in that sense, as I say, there's much less writing on it, so you're kind of reading between the lines. But my sense is that it probably wasn't. It was only ever sort of autonomy to a certain point. And the reality is that as time went on, and I think you have this very often as you go from being a popular movement to taking power, you gradually get distance from the organizing principles that you begin with. And I don't think that's particularly unusual for the EPRDF. It's obviously disappointing and doesn't live up to sort of the high aspirations that you begin with, but I don't think it's remotely unusual.
Well, I mean, we will wrap it up here for today, Tom, but just one final thought. It strikes me as something bizarre that Ethiopians have been trying to solve two problems for the past, 70, 80 years, the national issue and the land. And 70 years down the line, in a fundamental sense, we are where we were then. Um, and in some sense, it's as I say, it's so bizarre. But reading your book, it actually makes sense why. It was easy to see the wrong assumptions that people made in the past, whether the PRDF, whether it's the PRDF or the DERG, the understanding that people had, and the ways that they try to solve the problems and all that. Everything seems to kind of make sense. So in that sense, your book is a very I think it's a critical intervention into the Ethiopian political discourse, and I hope that many more people will read the book and try to have a proper conversation as to why it is that we haven't been able to solve these problems. So I would like to say thank you for writing the book, and you write articles and other products as well. So thank you for that, and also thank you for taking the time to come on our channel and talk about the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. No, it's been a pleasure to talk about it. Thank you for your detailed engagement, which is always welcome. The one thing I would say is that obviously broadly speaking, the same questions are still relevant now that they would, the land question, the national question that were 50 years ago. I would say though that it's not the same. Ethiopia's not in the same place. It's in quite a markedly different place in some ways. Some better, some worse. So I think in that sense, they're the same questions phrased differently, I guess, or something like that. And they are. I mean, yes, it seems it's frustrating, obviously, that they still the central sort of questions that shape Ethiopian politics. Yet they are difficult questions, and they are the kind of thing that in countries around the world have taken years, centuries, often with a lot of violence and unpleasantness to actually resolve. My hope is that, yeah, Ethiopia will find a way in the nearest future to resolving them. But yeah, they are long-term processes that, yeah, these fundamental questions about what a state looks like. State building is a process which takes centuries, and obviously Ethiopia's been going at it for longer than most. And yeah, I have, yeah, I still try to retain hope that it will find positive ways forward in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, everyone. That was Tom Lavers from the University of Manchester.